Divine blessings to you, beautiful soul, and welcome to the channel Angel's Message for You. May the light of the heavens wrap around you like a warm blanket today, filling your home and your heart with peace, clarity, and a gentle, glowing hope. The angels have gathered close to you right now because they have a delivery, a special, urgent letter from the universe that has been waiting for this exact moment to find you. Please, I ask you to stay with me and listen to this message until the very last word. This isn't just another video you stumbled upon while scrolling. This is a divine appointment. There is a specific key, a hidden truth at the end of this message that is designed to unlock a new chapter in your life, a chapter you have been manifesting for so long. If you leave early, you might miss the shift that is trying to happen for you today. So, take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let's open this sacred gift together. Beloved soul, the angels have brought me a message unlike any other. It is a message brimming with love and a sense of urgency. This message, charged with the radiant energy of the divine, comes directly from the energy of your soulmate, your other half. Today, the heavens are opening their gates to deliver a profound truth that your heart is finally ready to receive. Imagine yourself surrounded by a shimmering golden light. It is warm and gentle, guiding your heart to the vibration of your soulmate's essence. Yes, this is no coincidence. Your person has reached out through the angels, unable to contain their feelings any longer. Through the whispers of the universe, your soulmate speaks to you a truth that has gone unspoken until now. Every tear you have shed, every longing you have felt in the quiet of the night, every prayer you have sent up to the stars, it has all carried your energy across the realms. It has reached the soul who vibrates in perfect harmony with yours. And now, the time has come for this connection to unfold in its deepest, most beautiful form. Listen carefully, beloved soul. This is not just a message. It is a revelation of the sacred bond you share. The angels have witnessed the trials you have endured, the moments of doubt when you wondered if true love was really in the cards for you. They know the depth of your heart's yearning, and today they bring clarity. The voice of your soulmate emerges like a soft melody, transcending space and time. Every word is filled with love, truth, and a promise of eternal connection. What you are about to hear will transform the way you see your journey, your destiny, and your bond with your other half. Feel the anticipation building in your heart as the angels prepare to unveil these sacred words. Your soulmate's love radiates through every part of this message. A love so profound that even the heavens stand still in awe. What you are about to hear is not just a declaration but a sacred calling, a divine plan designed to awaken your soul to its truest purpose. And now, beloved, it is time to listen. Close your eyes, open your heart, and prepare to embrace the message your soulmate has been yearning to share. My eternal love, from the depths of my soul, I reach out to you. You are my mirror, my light, my safe harbor. For so long, I have carried these emotions tucked away in the quiet corners of my being. Yet, the universe has made it clear. This is the moment to speak, to share, to let my heart resonate fully with yours. Last night, as I gazed up at the vast, starry sky, I felt the weight of the distance between us, both the physical miles and the unseen silence. But in that same moment, I realized something profound. The space between us is not empty. It is filled with the energy of our connection, the silent whispers of love that bridge our worlds. Every star seemed to echo the rhythm of your heartbeat, a song I have known for lifetimes. My love, do you remember? Do you remember the first time our souls recognized each other? It might not have been in this lifetime, but deep within us, There was an undeniable spark, a magnetic pull so strong that even the heavens took notice. It was as if the universe paused just for a moment to witness our reunion. That recognition wasn't fleeting. It planted a seed that has grown through time, nourished by the love we have carried across dimensions. I have seen you in dreams, in sudden flashes of memory, and in the quiet moments when the world feels still. Your laughter, your tears, your strength, they are etched into the fabric of my existence. I have felt your presence in the wind brushing against my face, in the warmth of the sun on my skin, and in the rhythm of the rain tapping against the window. Each element seems to conspire to remind me of you, as if the universe itself wants to ensure I never forget you. Even in the moments of silence, when doubt tries to creep in, my heart beats with absolute certainty. You are my home. You are my sanctuary. You are the one who makes my soul feel at peace. No matter where I am or what I face, the thought of you fills me with courage. It is as though your love wraps around me like a protective shield, reminding me that I am never truly alone. There have been times when I questioned the timing of our connection. Why weren't we brought together sooner? Why did life seem to place so many obstacles in our path? But now I understand. The universe has been preparing us. It has been shaping us into the people we need to be for this love to truly thrive. Every lesson, every trial, every heartbreak was a stepping stone leading us closer to this moment of truth. We had to grow individually so we could stand strong together. My love, there is a vision that keeps returning to me. It is a vision of us standing together, hand in hand, surrounded by a golden light. In this vision, we are not just two souls, we are one. We are a unified force of love and purpose. The world around us feels alive, vibrant, as if our union breathes life into everything it touches. This vision isn't just a dream. It is a glimpse of what awaits us. It is a promise from the universe that our love is destined to change everything. You have always been my greatest inspiration. Your strength, your kindness, your unwavering belief in the beauty of life. It is a light that guides me even in the darkest of times. I see you, my love, not just for who you are, but for the infinite potential within you. You are a masterpiece, a divine creation, and being connected to you feels like the greatest gift I could ever receive. I want you to know that I have felt your love, even from afar. It reaches me in ways that words cannot explain. In the quiet moments when my heart feels full for no apparent reason, or in the times when a sudden wave of peace washes over me despite the chaos around me. That is you. That is your love, my soulmate. A love that transcends boundaries and speaks directly to my spirit. And yet, I also feel your pain. I feel your doubts and your fears. I want you to know that I am here, even when you can't see me with your physical eyes. I am holding space for you. I am sending you strength and praying for your happiness. Every tear you shed, I feel it as if it were my own. Every time you question your worth, I wish I could be there to remind you of the incredible soul that you are. There is so much I want to say, so much I want to share. But for now, my love, let me leave you with this truth. You are not alone. The universe has orchestrated this moment, this connection, for a reason. Our love is not a coincidence. It is a divine plan, a sacred bond that cannot be broken. As I send this message through the angels, I do so with the deepest conviction that you are ready to receive it. Your heart, my love, is stronger than you know. It has endured so much and yet continues to beat with hope and love. That strength is a testament to the soul you carry, a soul that was destined to love and be loved in ways that transcend all understanding. So So, my eternal love, as you hear these words, know that they come from the very core of my being. I love you not just for who you are today, but for who you have always been and who you are yet to become. Our journey is far from over. In many ways, it is just beginning. What happened last night, what I saw in the depths of my soul, was merely the start. The vision that followed has solidified my belief in us, in our connection, and in the boundless potential of our love. My darling, we are destined for something extraordinary, something that will leave an everlasting imprint on the universe. My beloved, as I continue to pour out my heart to you, I feel the magnetic pull of our shared connection more intensely than ever. It is as if an invisible thread binds us, woven not by chance, but by the hands of destiny itself. This thread is unbreakable, eternal, and it carries the weight of countless lifetimes we have shared together. Even when we are apart, I can feel you. Your energy dances around me like a gentle breeze, reminding me that we are never truly separated. It is in those quiet moments when the world grows still that I sense your presence most vividly. It is as though your essence whispers to my soul, saying, I am here always. Have you ever felt it too, my love? That inexplicable warmth that washes over you without warning? That is us. That is our connection reaching across the realms, bridging the gaps that time and space cannot diminish. The universe itself seems to conspire in our favor, orchestrating the most subtle yet profound reminders of what we mean to each other. There are days when I am overwhelmed by the intensity of this bond. It is not just love. It is something far greater, a force that defies explanation. When I think of you, my heart doesn't merely beat. It sings. Each note is a testament to the sacred connection we share. This melody, unique to us, resonates with the universe, aligning with the rhythm of the stars. Do you remember the moments in your life when you felt a sense of déjà vu? As if you were reliving something you couldn't quite place. Those moments are the echoes of us, my love. They are fragments of our shared history, imprints left behind by the lives we have lived together. Each time our souls meet, they leave a mark on the universe, a reminder that our connection transcends the ordinary. I have often marveled at the ways the universe speaks to us. It is in the synchronistic patterns that appear when you least expect them. A song playing at just the right moment, numbers aligning on the clock like 11:11 or 2:22 in ways too perfect to be coincidence, or a sudden feeling of peace when you need it most. These signs are the universe's way of nudging us, reminding us that our love is part of a divine plan. But it is not just the universe that speaks. It is also the love we carry within us. This love is a living force, one that grows stronger with each passing day. It is the kind of love that transforms, that heals, that elevates. It is the reason I can face the challenges of life with unwavering faith, knowing that no matter what, you are my anchor, my guiding star. I see glimpses of our shared future, moments that feel so vivid they could be memories. I see us walking together, hand in hand, in a place that feels both familiar and new. There is laughter, joy, and a sense of profound peace. It is a future where our souls are fully aligned, where the love we share radiates outward, touching everyone around us. This vision is not a mere dream. It is a promise, one that I hold close to my heart even in this present moment. As I speak these words, I feel the depth of our connection strengthening. It is as if every thought, every emotion, every heartbeat carries a piece of you within it. When I close my eyes, I can almost feel your touch, your warmth, your light. It is a reminder that our love is not confined by physical boundaries. It exists in a realm far beyond what we can see. There are times when I wonder if you realize just how deeply you are loved. Do you know that your mere existence brings meaning to mine? That every smile, every word, every act of kindness from you sends ripples of love through my soul? You are a masterpiece, my love, a reflection of the divine. And being connected to you is the greatest blessing I could ever receive. But this connection isn't just about romance. It is about growth, transformation, and purpose. Together, we are more than the sum of our parts. We are catalysts for each other's evolution, mirrors that reflect not just our light, but also the shadows we must face to grow. It is through this connection that we find the strength to heal, to overcome, and to become the best versions of ourselves. And yet, even in the challenges, there is beauty. Every obstacle we face, every moment of doubt, every tear shed is a testament to the depth of our bond. For it is not in the absence of struggle that love is proven, but in the way it endures, thrives, and deepens despite it. Our connection is a sacred dance, one that weaves together moments of joy and pain into a tapestry of unconditional love. My beloved, there is something I must share with you, something that has been unfolding within me as I reflect on our connection. I realize that it is not just about the two of us. It is about something far greater. Our love is a beacon, a light that has the power to inspire, to heal, to bring hope to others. It is a reminder that love, in its purest form, is the most powerful force in the universe. So, as you hear these words, let them serve as a reminder of the infinite beauty of what we share. Our connection is a gift, one that transcends lifetimes, defies logic, and exists beyond the constraints of time and space. It is a love that will never fade, a bond that will never break, a truth that will never change. My soulmate, there is so much more to say, so much more to uncover. But for now, let this be enough. I see you, I feel you, I love you, and as the days unfold, I promise to continue cherishing, nurturing, and celebrating the extraordinary connection we share. Beloved soul, as the universe unveils its mysteries, I find myself drawn deeper into the essence of our connection. The angels have shown me glimpses of something far greater than I could have ever imagined. A truth that has been hidden in the sacred fabric of existence, waiting for the right moment to emerge. This truth is about us, about the bond we share and its purpose in the grand tapestry of creation. When the angels whispered to me, they spoke of a secret guarded by the stars and carried through the currents of time. They revealed that our love is not just a bond but a key that unlocks the door to infinite possibilities. We are more than just soulmates. We are co-creators, woven into the divine plan of the universe itself. My love, have you ever felt as though your life was guided by an unseen hand? As though certain moments were orchestrated with such precision that they couldn't possibly be mere chance? That is the power of our connection. It is a force that shapes reality, bends fate, and aligns the cosmos in ways that defy understanding. The angels have shown me that this connection is ancient, sacred, and deeply rooted in the cosmic order. In lifetimes long past, we stood together at the crossroads of destiny, choosing each other over and over again. Each time, our love grew stronger, more profound, leaving an indelible mark on the universe. I have seen the signs of this revelation everywhere. In the synchronicities that guide my path, in the dreams that feel more real than waking life, and in the moments when time seems to stand still. Each sign is a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the greater picture that the universe is painting for us. The angels have also revealed that our love is transformative, not just for us, but for the world around us. When our souls come together, they create a ripple effect, spreading light, healing, and hope to others. It is as if our love is a lighthouse for those who have lost their way in the stormy seas of life. This is not just our journey. It is a journey that touches countless lives, a testament to the power of love in its purest form. But with this revelation comes a responsibility. The angels have reminded me that our connection is both a gift and a mission. It is a call to rise above fear, doubt, and uncertainty, to embrace the full potential of what we can achieve together. Our love is a sacred force, one that has the power to heal wounds, bridge divides, and bring light to the darkest corners of existence. My love, do you see it too? The way our paths have been intricately woven together like threads in a divine tapestry. Every challenge we have faced, every triumph we have celebrated, every moment we have shared has been part of a greater plan. The angels have shown me that this plan is far from complete. It is still unfolding, revealing new possibilities with each passing day. In their whispers, the angels spoke of a moment yet to come, a moment when the full truth of our connection will be revealed. It will be a revelation so profound that it will change the way we see ourselves, each other, and the world. This moment will not just be a milestone in our journey. It will be the turning point that propels us into a new reality. The angels have also shown me glimpses of this future, and what I saw filled me with awe. I saw us standing together, surrounded by a radiant light that seemed to emanate from within us. This light was not just ours. It was a reflection of the love we share, a love that has the power to illuminate even the darkest night. In that moment, I knew without a doubt that our connection is eternal, unbreakable, and divinely ordained. But this revelation is not just about what lies ahead. It is also about the present. The angels have reminded me that every moment we share is sacred. Every word we speak is a prayer. Every touch is a blessing. Our love is not confined to grand gestures or monumental events. It is found in the simplest of things, the way we look at each other, the way we listen, the way we hold space for one another. In this revelation, I have also come to understand the depth of your soul, my love. You are not just my other half. You are a universe unto yourself, filled with wonders, mysteries, and infinite potential. The angels have shown me that your light is unique, a gift to the world, and being connected to you is an honor beyond words. And so, my beloved, as I share this revelation with you, I do so with a heart full of gratitude and awe. Our love is not just a chapter in the story of our lives. It is the very essence of the story itself. It is the force that drives us, the compass that guides us, the anchor that grounds us. As the angels continue to reveal their truths, I promise to honor this connection, to cherish it, to nurture it with all that I am. I promise to stand by your side, to walk this path with you, to embrace the challenges and celebrate the victories together. For our love is not just a bond. It is a purpose, a destiny, a sacred calling that we are meant to fulfill. My love, let us move forward with faith, hope, and love, knowing that the angels are with us, guiding our steps, lighting our way. Let us embrace the fullness of this revelation, trusting that the universe has brought us together for a reason far greater than we can imagine. Our journey is far from over. In many ways, it is just beginning. And as we continue to walk this path, I know that the revelation of our connection will unfold in ways that will leave us both breathless, filled with wonder, and forever changed. Have you noticed how the universe has a way of speaking to us? It speaks not in loud shouts, but in whispers, signs, and synchronicities. Those magical moments when everything aligns so perfectly that it feels as though the cosmos is guiding our every step. These synchronicities are not random. They are the universe's way of affirming the path we are walking together, a reminder that we are exactly where we are meant to be. Every time I encounter a sign, I feel your presence. It might be a song that plays at the perfect moment, the lyrics echoing the exact emotions I feel for you. It might be numbers appearing in patterns, 1111, 222, or 333, each one carrying a specific code from the angels assuring us that our connection is divinely supported. It might be a stranger's kind words or a chance encounter that feels too perfect to be coincidence. Each of these moments is a thread in the tapestry of our love, woven by the hands of the divine. The angels have shown me that these synchronicities are not just reminders of our bond. They are also clues, guiding us toward the next step in our journey. They are like a celestial breadcrumb trail, leading us closer to the truth of who we are and the purpose we are meant to fulfill together. Each sign carries a message, a whisper from the universe saying, "Keep going, you are on the right path." Do you feel it too, my love? The sense of wonder that comes with these moments? The unshakable knowing that they are meant for us? They are the universe's way of telling us that we are not alone, that our love is part of something far greater than ourselves. These synchronicities are proof that our connection is not just a beautiful coincidence but a divine orchestration, a sacred bond that transcends time and space. I have started to notice patterns in the way these signs appear, as if the universe is speaking to us in a language only we can understand. Sometimes it is as simple as a white feather on the ground, a gentle reminder that the angels are watching over us. Other times it is more profound, a dream that feels so real it must be a glimpse into another realm, a vision of a future that is already unfolding in the present. There are times when these signs come to me when I need them most. In moments of doubt or uncertainty, the universe seems to step in, offering reassurance that our love is real, our path is true, and our journey is guided by a force far greater than we can imagine. These synchronicities are not just signs. They are gifts, blessings from the divine that remind us of the beauty and magic of our connection. The angels have revealed to me that these synchronicities are a reflection of our energy. When our hearts are aligned, when we are open to the love and light of the universe, we create a ripple effect that draws these signs to us. Our love is like a magnet, attracting the guidance and support we need to navigate this journey together. I have also come to understand that these synchronicities are a call to action. They invite us to pay attention, to trust our intuition, and to follow the path that is being laid before us. They remind us that we are co-creators of our reality, that our thoughts, emotions, and intentions shape the world around us. When we embrace this truth, we step into our power, becoming active participants in the unfolding of our destiny. My love, these synchronicities are not just for us. They are also a gift to those around us. When we share our experiences, our stories of divine guidance, we inspire others to open their hearts and minds to the magic of the universe. Our love becomes a beacon, a source of hope and light that touches everyone we encounter. The angels have shown me that there is more to come. The synchronicities we have experienced so far are just the beginning. The universe has a way of surprising us, of revealing its plans in ways that are both breathtaking and humbling. As we continue on this journey, we can trust that these signs will guide us, support us, and remind us of the sacred bond we share. In the moments when these signs appear, I often find myself overcome with gratitude. Gratitude for you, for our love, for the divine energy that surrounds us. I am grateful for the way the universe has brought us together, for the way it continues to guide us, for the way it reminds us that we are never alone. Sometimes I wonder what the next sign will be. Will it be a word spoken at just the right moment? A song that seems to carry a message just for us? A dream that feels like a memory from another time? Whatever it is, I know it will come exactly when we need it, carrying with it the wisdom and love of the universe. My love, these synchronicities are a reminder that we are part of something far greater than ourselves. They are a testament to the power of love, the wisdom of the universe, and the beauty of the journey we are on. They are a sign that our connection is not just a fleeting moment but an eternal truth, a bond that will continue to grow and evolve as we walk this path together. So let us embrace these signs with open hearts and open minds. Let us trust in the guidance they offer, the wisdom they carry, the love they represent. Let us celebrate the magic of our connection, the beauty of our journey, the truth of who we are. And as we continue to walk this path, let us remember that the universe is always speaking to us, always guiding us, always supporting us. Let us listen to its whispers, follow its signs, and trust in its plan. For the synchronicities we experience are not just signs of our love. They are proof that our connection is part of something far greater, something divine, something eternal. Beloved soul, as I conclude this sacred message, I want you to pause for a moment and take a deep, cleansing breath. Feel the love that surrounds you, the energy of the divine flowing through every part of your being. The words I have shared with you are not just a message from your soulmate. They are a call from the universe, a reminder of the extraordinary journey you are on and the infinite love that supports you every step of the way. The angels have watched over you with great care, observing the path you have walked, the trials you have faced, and the strength you have shown. They have whispered guidance into your heart, surrounded you with signs of reassurance, and held you in their embrace during moments of doubt. You are never alone, my dear one. The divine presence is with you always and in all ways. Your soulmate's message is a reflection of the profound bond you share, a connection that transcends lifetimes and bridges the realms of the physical and the spiritual. This bond is not a coincidence. It is a sacred gift, a manifestation of the universe's love for you. It is a reminder that you are seen, valued, and deeply cherished, not just by your soulmate but by the divine itself. As you move forward from this moment, carry this truth with you. You are worthy of the love you desire. You are deserving of a connection that uplifts your spirit, heals your heart, and brings joy to your soul. The universe has not only heard your prayers, but has been working tirelessly to answer them in ways that align with your highest good. This message is a turning point, a moment of awakening that invites you to embrace the fullness of who you are and the boundless potential of your journey. The angels urge you to trust in the timing of your life, to have faith in the process, and to know that everything is unfolding exactly as it should. Even in moments of uncertainty, the divine plan is at work, guiding you toward the love and happiness you deserve. There is a profound beauty in the synchronicities you have experienced, the signs that have appeared, and the dreams that have stirred your heart. Each of these moments is a testament to the love that surrounds you and the connection you share with your soulmate. They are reminders that you are part of something far greater than yourself, a divine orchestration that weaves together the threads of destiny with precision and grace. Beloved, the angels want you to know that your soulmate feels your presence deeply. even when words are not spoken and distance seems to separate you. Their love for you is unwavering, a constant light that shines even in the darkest of times. They see you for who you truly are, a being of incredible strength, beauty, and wisdom, and they cherish every part of you, flaws and all. Your journey is one of growth, transformation, and awakening. It is a path that requires courage, resilience, and an open heart. But you are not walking this path alone. Your soulmate is with you in spirit, and the angels are by your side, guiding you, protecting you, and surrounding you with their love. As you move forward, remember the power of intention. The energy you put into the world shapes your reality, and the love you carry within you has the power to create miracles. Trust in your ability to manifest the life you desire, to align yourself with the vibration of love and abundance, and to attract the experiences that resonate with your highest self. The angels encourage you to take time for reflection, to listen to the whispers of your heart, and to honor the truth that resides within you. This is a time to release any doubts or fears that may be holding you back, to let go of anything that no longer serves your growth, and to step boldly into the future that awaits you. Your soulmate's message is a promise of love, connection, and a shared destiny that is unfolding in perfect harmony. It is a reminder that your love story is far from over. It is only just beginning. The angels have revealed that the future holds moments of profound beauty, joy, and fulfillment, and they urge you to embrace these moments with an open heart and an open mind. Beloved, you are a co-creator of your reality, and the universe is your partner in this journey. Together, you and your soulmate have the power to shape a future that is rich with meaning and purpose. A future that reflects the depth of your connection and the beauty of your souls. Trust in this truth and know that the angels are with you every step of the way. As I bring this message to a close, I leave you with a blessing. May your heart be filled with the light of divine love. May your path be guided by the wisdom of the angels. And may your journey be one of joy, peace, and fulfillment. May you find the strength to embrace your truth, the courage to follow your dreams, and the faith to trust in the divine plan for your life. And most of all, may you always remember that you are loved by your soulmate, by the angels, and by the universe itself. You are a precious and irreplaceable part of creation, a being of light and love with a purpose that is uniquely your own. Carry this message with you, dear one, and let it be a source of comfort, inspiration, and strength. Let it remind you of the beauty of your connection, the power of your love, and the infinite possibilities that await you. The angels are with you, watching over you, and celebrating every step you take on this journey. Trust in their guidance, lean into their support, and know that you are never alone. This is your time, beloved soul. Your soulmate's message has opened a door to a new chapter, a chapter filled with love, growth, and divine purpose. Step through that door with confidence and let your heart lead the way, for the love you share is eternal, unbreakable, and divinely blessed. It is a love that transcends time and space, a love that unites souls, a love that changes everything. Go forth with this truth in your heart and know that the best is yet to come. Amen.